Hello, and welcome to Midnight Tales, a space where everyone can immerse themselves in peace and enchantment before drifting off to sleep. Tonight, we'll explore another captivating story that invites calm and lightness, helping you rest and recharge. But first, let's take a moment to gently prepare our bodies and minds for a soothing, restorative night's sleep. Make yourself comfortable, and with each slow inhale and long exhale, allow any cares from the day to slip away. It's not always easy to detach from the hustle and mental overload, especially before bed. However, remember this: the less we worry about how quickly we'll fall asleep, the easier it is for our minds to release any tension. Let the rhythm of your breathing carry away lingering worries, and let the story you're about to hear guide you into deep relaxation. Now, close your eyes and allow the magical atmosphere to softly envelop you. Enjoy the story, and may you find peaceful, restful sleep here on Midnight Tales. Once upon a time, there was a merchant named Laurent who had invested his entire wealth in a fleet of ships, only to face the heartbreak of losing them all at sea. As a widower, he didn't need to break this devastating news to a wife, but he did have 6 children, accustomed to a life of comfort and luxury. When the creditors came calling and the word spread that the family was now destitute, the news hit them hard. With each day that passed without any sign of the ships returning, Laurent found himself compelled to sell their treasured possessions, furniture, their elegant carriage, and even his daughter's beautiful jewelry in fine dresses. Soon enough, they had to leave their grand home behind and relocate to a humble cottage on the edge of town. Laurent often ventured out in search of investments and partners to help him rebuild his business. Meanwhile, his 3 sons and 3 daughters, mostly grown yet lacking practical skills, were left to manage their household, while the older siblings struggled to adapt to their new circumstances. Camille, the youngest daughter, embraced her responsibilities with enthusiasm, learning how to run a home without the help of servants. Well liked by everyone in the village, Camille sought guidance from her neighbors on baking bread, sewing clothes, tending to gardens, and raising chickens. Her eagerness to learn and her diligent work ethic endeared her to the villagers, who grew fond of her bright spirit. In time, she became the steady support that held Laurent's family together. As her older siblings wrestled with their new reality, Camille made sure that their home remained tidy and that meals were always ready on the table. Nearly 2 years into this new way of life, Laurent received wonderful news. One of his lost ships had finally returned to port with most of its cargo intact. The family rejoiced at this miraculous turn of fortune. While her older siblings were eager to leave behind their modest life among the villagers, Camille found joy in their simple cottage, a place filled with a neat garden and the warm aroma of freshly baked bread. Though she was delighted to see her family so happy again, she felt uncertain about returning to their previous life of luxury. She had come to appreciate the fulfillment that came from being helpful and valued in her new world. To reclaim his possessions, Laurent embarked on a horseback journey to the port, a trek that would span a few days. Upon reaching his destination, He planned to oversee the fair distribution of his regained wealth and hire a cozy carriage for his return trip. Eagerly anticipating their brighter future, he asked each of his children what gift they would like from the city. The older siblings made lavish requests: silk shoes adorned with glimmering buckles, elaborately decorated hats, plush velvet capes, cuddly bears, and sparkling jewels. Only Camille remained quiet, lost in thought about her wish. When her father gently urged her to share her desire, she paused for a moment before replying, "Father, I have always dreamed of seeing a rose. They don't bloom in our area and are so rare and precious." She expressed her longing for just one rose in any color she could find lovely. Laurent chuckled at his youngest child's unique wish, but readily agreed to fulfill it. Secretly, he decided to surprise her with a necklace or another small treasure to accompany the flower. The morning of his departure dawned bright and cheerful. Camille carefully filled his saddlebag with supplies for the journey and bid him goodbye with a bittersweet smile glistening in her eyes. The others were more indifferent, accustomed to their father's absences and preoccupied with the delightful gifts they anticipated upon his return. As Laurent rode down the sun-dappled forest path, Camille stood alone outside their cottage until he disappeared from view. A peculiar feeling of unease washed over her, yet she chose to keep it to herself. After all, it seemed their fortunes were finally turning for the better. While Laurent's children waited at home, he steadily made his way toward the port city, filled with hope of recovering his fortune and status. It was true that he had endured substantial losses. However, with the cargo aboard the ship, he envisioned starting anew, perhaps even building a fleet of ships. His mind danced with dreams of importing spices, silks, and other treasures in the days to come. Thus, it was utterly heartbreaking for him to arrive, only to find that all his hopes lay in ruins. Indeed, the ship had returned, bringing with it most of its cargo. However, word of his unexpected fortune spread quickly, prompting his many creditors to spring into action. By the time Laurent arrived to reclaim his belongings, they had already been distributed to settle his numerous debts. Despite his attempts to negotiate for extensions on his hefty bills with various merchants, all efforts proved futile. As the day drew to a close, he found himself free of debt, but utterly empty-handed. There were no funds left for investment, and certainly not enough to buy the gifts he had promised his family. Feeling despondent, Laurent had no desire to linger in the city overnight. Without taking the time to prepare for the journey ahead, neglecting provisions, considering the weather, or sending word before him, he mounted his weary horse and set off down the provincial road that had led him to the port that very morning. A few hours later, as darkness enveloped the landscape, a storm swept in. Lightning flashed and thunder rumbled around him, while fierce winds howled, snapping branches from trees. Startled by the tempest, Laurent's horse bolted off the main road and into an unfamiliar forest. Realizing too late how unwise it was to embark on this nighttime ride, Laurent began searching through the gusty winds for any form of shelter, a cave or refuge from the storm. He lost track of time as they wandered through the raging gale, until finally a tall stone wall loomed before him. Spurring his horse onward in hope of finding a place to take cover, he approached what he thought might be a house, but discovered it was merely an estate's imposing wall. Before him stood a grand iron gate, slightly ajar. With little regard for decorum in such dire circumstances, Laurent dismounted and pushed open the heavy gate wider to lead his horse through. Together, they ventured up a cobblestone path that faded into the swirling shadows ahead. Leaves danced wildly around him as rain drummed against him from all sides. Visibility was poor as a massive structure began to emerge from the oppressive gloom. It was unmistakably a mansion. Though his sight was somewhat limited, he could discern that the building had a majestic entrance and numerous spacious rooms adorned with tall windows. It was quite an imposing place for anyone to arrive uninvited, yet he felt he had no choice. The thought of spending the night exposed to the elements filled him with dread. He needed shelter. After securing his horse in a sheltered nook, he approached the enormous front door and grasped the heavy iron knocker. He let it fall, its sound resonating through the dimness, echoing like distant thunder. When silence followed, he took a deep breath and leaned against the door, pushing it open with all of his strength. To his surprise, it swung wide, causing him to stumble slightly as he entered the grand foyer. Laurent paused for a moment on the cold stone floor, gathering himself in the eerie quiet. He could still hear the rain pounding against the front steps through a gap in the towering door, and felt relieved that he had secured a safe place for his horse. As he rose in the dim light, he glanced around. He stood in a magnificent reception hall where a sweeping staircase curved gracefully on either side. Suits of armor lined the walls like vigilant guardians. Before him loomed a pair of intricately carved double doors. The stillness within was profound, so silent that one could almost hear a pin drop, yet a gentle glow filtered through the cracks of the doors ahead. Despite making several hesitant attempts to call out to anyone who might be inside, he finally mustered his courage and stepped toward the warmly lit room, slowly pushing open the doors. Upon entering, he took in his surroundings. A roaring fire danced in the grand hearth, casting flickering shadows around the room. A table set for one showcased a modest selection of dishes alongside a carafe and an ample drinking glass. His gaze drifted across this inviting space, noting plush chairs and tables strewn with books that hinted at stories waiting to be discovered. However, there was no sign of the homeowner. Laurent awkwardly settled into one of the armchairs, waiting for a moment. The delicious meal spread before him proved irresistible, and he found himself drawn to the warm loaf of bread, and the enticing aroma of the roasted meat. As time ticked by, with no indication of anyone arriving, his stomach rumbled audibly, compelling him to give in to his hunger. He moved to the table and started with a slice of bread, gradually savoring every morsel of the feast at a leisurely pace. An hour slipped away in peaceful silence, leading him to believe that the homeowner was absent, perhaps finding shelter from the storm elsewhere. Enjoying a deep sip from his glass, he eagerly finished off the remnants of dinner. Convinced that the homeowner was away, Laurent reassured himself that he could explain his uninvited presence come morning. After clearing his plate, he reclined contentedly in his chair, draining the carafe. The crackling fire enveloped him in warmth as he sipped the last drop from his glass and reached into his pocket for a letter about his recovered cargo ship. Once filled with hope, those dreams now felt distant and faded. Unconsciously pushing the letter aside on the table, he surrendered to a deep slumber. Throughout the night, he slept soundly without any dreams. When morning arrived, it took him a moment to gather his bearings. The fire had long since died down, and remnants of last night's meal lingered on the table. It appeared that the homeowner had not yet returned. Feeling a wave of embarrassment for having intruded into someone else's home, discomfort washed over him. Rather than wait for the owner's return, Laurent decided it best to leave, quietly and swiftly, justifying that the untouched dinner would have gone uneaten anyway. He rose from his chair and crossed the room to open the double doors. Soft light filtered into the entryway, illuminating the stark hallway more clearly than it had during the night. As he stepped cautiously into the foyer, it felt as though he were treading on eggshells among the vigilant suits of armor lining the walls, half expecting them to spring to life and block his path. He surveyed the grand twin staircases, adorned with their faded, ornate carpet runners, and couldn't shake off an unsettling feeling that this place had been empty for quite some time. As he approached the grand front door, he grasped the handles firmly, summoning all his strength to slowly pull it open. Beyond lay a misty courtyard that beckoned him forth. After slipping through the threshold and gently closing the door behind him, he straightened his waistcoat, attempting to regain his composure, although a sense of unease washed over him at the thought of leaving the imposing mansion like a thief in the night. He resolved to leave this embarrassing chapter behind. He hurried back to the alcove where his horse had been tied the previous evening, feeling a wave of relief upon finding her in good spirits. From his saddlebag, he retrieved an apple, a remnant from Camille's thoughtful provisions, and offered it to the grateful creature. Once untethered, he led her quietly along the stone path he had navigated through the blustery darkness just hours before. A glance over his shoulder revealed the mansion looming ominously in the brightening day. The vast chateau stretched long and rectangular, with a central section flanked by matching wings on either side. Tall, narrow windows lined its two formidable floors in an orderly fashion, seemingly gazing down upon him with an air of authority. The roof, adorned with thick chimneys and sloping tiles, added to its grand presence. Shifting his focus away from the imposing structure, He guided his horse toward the front gate, taking in the wild gardens that flourished on either side. As he neared the end of the pathway, he spotted a charmingly unruly pergola draped with rose bushes. In the center of a circular seating area stood a rose bush, boasting the most exquisite pink blooms he had ever encountered. Recalling his promise to Camille, his youngest daughter, he felt determined to keep his word. With a knife from his bag in hand, he eagerly began snipping off the delicate roses from their bush, intent on gathering them all as a symbol of his devotion. Engrossed in his task, he was unaware of footsteps drawing near until he stepped back from the now bare bush and sensed someone watching him. Turning around, he found himself face to face with a rugged figure whose stern gaze bore into him. Though resembling a man, this being was distinguished by an unruly mane of facial hair and an unusually tall and muscular build. Caught off guard and appearing disheveled in a hastily donned linen shirt and breeches, there was an unmistakable fury etched across his features. "What do you think you're doing?" he snarled, his voice low and menacing like a wolf's growl. Laurent stood there, frozen in place, acutely aware of the bouquet of roses clutched tightly in his left hand. Stumbling over his words, he explained that he had assumed the house was empty and that the flowers would go unnoticed. Noticing no shift in the man's fierce expression, he weakly added that he had promised roses to his daughter. The man in the linen shirt, exuding an intimidating presence, paused as if weighing his response. Standing tall, he proclaimed, "You have taken advantage of my hospitality without permission. You feasted and rested here, which I was willing to overlook. However, by stripping my beloved rose bush of its blooms, you have crossed a line. Each flower carries deep personal significance for me and cannot be replaced. I demand that you find a way to make amends for this loss." Hearing these words made Laurent's heart plummet. He shook his head in defeat, admitting he had nothing to offer in return. The stern host regarded him with icy eyes. "In that case, you must work to repay your debt," he declared firmly. "I need laborers at my estate." Laurent looked at him in disbelief and tried to suggest another option. "But sir," he protested, "I have 6 children waiting for me at home. I cannot stay here. What will become of them?" The man remained unmoved by Laurent's plea. "Either you work off your debt, or someone from your family must take your place," he insisted. "Take your roses. They hold no value for me now," the man continued coldly. "Return to your family and make arrangements. I expect either you or a substitute within a week's time. If you fail to comply, there will be consequences." With that final remark, the stern man turned away without a glance back. Laurent watched him disappear into the chateau, realizing he had no choice but to return home and prepare his children for his absence. Perhaps once the man calmed down, he might release Laurent from this obligation. As he rode slowly yet steadily back home, thoughts swirled in his mind about how to break the news to his family. Despite the beautiful day, with mist lifting and sunlight breaking through the clouds, his heart felt heavy with worry about what lay ahead. He arrived home late that evening to find his children bubbling with excitement. They had been eagerly anticipating gifts from their father. As they rushed around him, playfully rummaging through his saddlebags for treasures, Laurent felt a pang of regret, as he could only offer each of them a single rose instead of the promised finery. Camille took her rose first and inhaled its sweet fragrance with delight, marveling at its beauty. But his other 5 children were quick to demand their real presents instead. That evening, gathered around the bustling kitchen table, Laurent shared with his children the tale of his unfortunate trip to the port city. He recounted how he had lost the last of their fortune and explained the circumstances that led him to owe a debt to the enigmatic owner of the chateau. When he finished, revealing that he would need to return and work off what he owed, his 5 eldest children frowned in discontent. They sulked, questioning how they would manage without him. Among them, Camille remained silent. She sat quietly at the table, her expression inscrutable as she drifted into her own thoughts. Finally, she called for silence, surprising her siblings, who were accustomed to her being more reserved. Camille declared that she would take her father's place at the chateau. Tears welled in Laurent's eyes as he vehemently protested against such an idea. Yet, Camille's logical arguments were hard to refute. Their father was essential at home to support their family. She could be spared. Moreover, she possessed some skills in household chores and would be able to handle any cleaning or cooking tasks assigned to her. In the end, she concluded that there was no other sensible option. She would be the one to repay their family's debt. It took Camille a day or 2 to ready her few belongings for the journey ahead. As the rose her father had given her began to fade, she pressed it between the pages of a book for safekeeping. It served as a reminder of why she was leaving everything familiar behind to work for a stranger in a far-off and secluded estate. Though anxiety gripped her about departing from all she had ever known, determination filled her heart as she resolved to make her father proud. The morning of Camille's departure arrived bright and clear. Together with Laurent, they loaded her possessions into a small cart hitched to their loyal mare. The chateau lay 2 days' journey ahead, with the horse pulling their cart. Laurent knew of an inn along the way where they could rest for the night. Her 4 remaining siblings gathered outside their cottage to bid them farewell, feelings of relief mingling with unspoken admiration among them. They were grateful that they wouldn't have to face solitude for long. The journey was a solemn one for both Laurent and Camille. The weather remained pleasant throughout their first day, and their night spent at the inn passed without incident. The second day of their journey unfolded with a brisk and gloomy atmosphere as autumn began to weave its way through the forest. Brown leaves, the first victims of the changing season, danced across their path while the wind sang a haunting melody through the trees. Their loyal mare trotted steadily along the road, inching them closer to an inevitable farewell. When Laurent spotted the turnoff leading to the chateau, a heaviness settled in his heart with each step they took. Sensing her father's sorrow, Camille mustered her courage and offered him a warm smile. "Don't worry, father," she reassured him. "I am capable. I will manage." He nodded, holding on to hope that her words would ring true. At last, they arrived at the somber entrance of the estate. Laurent understood that this was the moment they had been approaching. With determination, he pushed open the gate, guiding their horse through as they approached the imposing mansion for a second time. Camille stared in awe at what lay before her. The elaborate gardens, now wild and overgrown, alongside the towering walls of the house, exceeded anything she had ever encountered. It was both overwhelming and striking in its starkness. Coming from a humble village background, Camille found herself speechless in front of such grandeur, feeling the weight of its secrets and permanence. The stones seemed to be resting in deep slumber, as if waiting patiently for someone to uncover their stories once again. She contemplated the tasks that awaited her within those formidable walls, and hoped they were within her reach. Bringing the horse and cart to a halt at the wide front steps, Laurent braced himself against the wind that seemed determined to push them away from their destination. Together, they climbed slowly up to the door. Laurent lifted the heavy door knocker and let it fall with a resonant thud. Father and daughter stood on those steps, awaiting the appearance of the stern master of this grand house. To their astonishment, when the door creaked open, it revealed a boy who appeared to be around 13 years old, dressed simply in village garb. He peered out at them with curious eyes before nodding in approval. "One of you here as the new servant?" he asked. Laurent was caught off guard for a moment, but quickly explained that he had brought his daughter Camille to work off his debt in his stead. The boy nodded knowingly, as if this were entirely expected, and opened the door wider, inviting her inside. With that, the voice scurried away into the depths of the house, likely to inform everyone that the new servant had arrived, buoyed by the wind at her back. Camille stepped through the doorway and into her new life. It was a bittersweet farewell for both Laurent and Camille. Yet they each wore a brave smile. The loyal mare turned towards home, the heavy clouds looming above them, not glancing back until they had passed through the chateau's gates. Then the swaying trees of the forest enveloped them behind. Camille stood hesitantly in the vast hallway, where the dim light of the overcast day filtered through tall windows above the door, failing to bring any warmth to the space. She stifled a shiver and moved closer to her trunk, filled with belongings. Reminding herself to summon her courage and do her best, she waited quietly. Moments later, a boy dashed back into the hall and cheerfully informed her that the Baron had instructed him to show her to her room. With that, he eagerly lifted her trunk and began hauling it up the grand sweeping staircase. Camille followed him, surprised that they were ascending rather than descending toward a kitchen or lower chamber. Perhaps she would be staying in an attic. To her astonishment, he turned down a magnificent hallway as they padded along the richly carpeted east wing of the chateau. Their quiet footsteps echoed past portraits of noble figures from long ago, who seemed to watch them with timeless gazes, as if this strange girl were an uninvited guest within their eternal abode. So captivated was Camille by their expressions that she nearly bumped into Gabriel when he finally halted before a door and swung it open. Stepping inside after him, Camille was taken aback by the sight of one of the most exquisite bedrooms she had ever encountered. It wasn't overly spacious, and its furnishings were modest, yet the canopied bed, fine fabrics draping elegantly, and rich wooden accents exuded luxury. As she took in her surroundings, a cozy window seat and a small dressing table, the boy began to light a fire in the grate. Once it crackled warmly to life, he stood back and dusted off his hands with a grin. "I'm Gabriel," he introduced himself. "I help out around here for the Baron with various tasks. I'm really glad you've come. It can get rather lonely sometimes, and I could use some assistance with daily matters." Unsure how to respond, Camille felt curious about what those daily matters entailed, but instead expressed her gratitude for the fire and inquired when she might meet her new employer. Gabriel gently let her know that the Baron had mentioned he would meet with her the following day to explain her responsibilities. For the moment, he would be bringing her a modest supper and hoped she would find restful slumber that night. With that, Gabriel quietly exited the room, closing the door softly behind him. Taking a deep breath, Camille set about unpacking her belongings. She hung her garments in the spacious wardrobe and carefully arranged her few books on a side table beside the bed. As she opened one of them, a delicate pink rose slipped out from between the pages, evoking a bittersweet smile upon her lips. After setting the book aside, she wandered over to the window, pulled back the heavy drapes, and nestled into the plush cushions of the window seat. From this cozy nook, she gazed out over the courtyard, where wild gardens meandered along winding paths and climbed up the stone walls of the chateau. The dusk was settling in, and a gentle breeze stirred debris across the cobblestone yard, creating little whirlwinds that danced playfully around. Dark clouds hurried past the newly risen moon. Exhausted from her travels and overwhelmed by her unfamiliar surroundings, she soon drifted into a light slumber, wrapped in the soft embrace of the curtains. A gentle knock on her door stirred her awake. Untangling herself from her cozy spot, she took a moment to steady her breathing before opening the door to find a tray awaiting her outside, laden with bread, cheese, soup, and steaming tea. She glanced down the hallway, but saw no one. Gabriel certainly moved like a shadow. Carrying the tray inside, she set it on a small table by the fireplace. Starving after her journey, she savored every bite of her meal. Skipping any elaborate bedtime rituals, she pulled back the coverlet and slipped into the inviting warmth of her sheets and pillow before surrendering swiftly to sleep. Throughout the night, Camille found herself caught in strange dreams. She wandered through dimly lit corridors of the chateau while trailing after a large dog that would slip into various rooms, only to reappear moments later in the hallway. Eager to catch up with it, she arrived at a doorway where it had just vanished. Peering inside, instead of finding a dog, she spotted only a man seated at a desk with his back turned toward her. Just as he began to turn his chair around to face her, she jolted awake. Sitting upright in bed, she noticed how low the fire had burned down and felt warmth from sunlight streaming through her window. As her initial bewilderment faded, a gentle knock echoed at her door. Standing there was Gabriel, holding a tray in his hands. "Good morning, Miss Meal," he said with a polite smile. "I've brought you some breakfast." He gestured vaguely towards the entrance and added, "The Baron would like to see you in his study after you've finished." Camille nodded at the young boy, accepted the tray, and watched as he quietly slipped away. An hour later, Camille found herself standing anxiously before the very door where her father had once enjoyed his secret fireside meal. She could hear the sound of papers rustling inside. Taking a deep breath, she cleared her throat and tapped gently on the door. The commotion halted abruptly, followed by the scraping of a chair across the floor. Moments later, a man emerged, his face adorned with an abundance of facial hair. His features were rather pronounced, and his expression seemed to carry a natural frown. Although he was quite an intimidating figure, Camille made sure to mask her apprehension. She dipped her head in a polite greeting. The large man scrutinized her for a moment before nodding his head awkwardly in response. Then he motioned for her to take a seat in a chair near the fire. He settled himself into the armchair opposite her. "You will be the one to settle your father's debt," he stated. "Are you experienced with basic household chores, like cleaning and cooking?" Camille nodded, confirming her familiarity with these tasks. The man seemed pleased by her response. He picked up a hefty ring of keys from a nearby table. "As you can see, I am quite short on help here," he explained. "Gabriel attends to my essential needs, while his mother supplies me with bread, milk, and eggs each day, and he runs errands in town. However, aside from myself, there's no one else to manage the estate. You can tell that just by looking around. It's still too much work for just you and Gabriel, but we'll make it work." He paused, as if expecting her to respond. Camille felt overwhelmed at the thought of being the sole housekeeper in such a vast mansion, yet she sensed there was little point in voicing her concerns. The man continued, "These keys will unlock most of the rooms in the house, although there isn't much need to access many of them. If you require something that Gabriel cannot fetch for you, please let me know. Otherwise, I'm not particular, and would prefer that you make as many household decisions on your own as possible. I spend most of my time in my study or the library." Overwhelmed by the magnitude of the responsibilities he was placing upon her, Camille simply nodded, signaling that their conversation was over. He stood up suddenly. Camille rose from her seat, accepted the ancient-looking keys from him with a nod, and as she turned to leave the room, he called out after her, "Dinner is at 7 p.m. It would be wise for you to join me in the dining room." Camille bobbed her head in acknowledgement, expressed her thanks, and exited the study. Standing in the expansive front hall, she felt both lost within its grandeur and as if it were closing in around her. She spread the heavy keys across her palm and gazed at them thoughtfully. Though she didn't know what doors they unlocked, they exuded a quiet sense of authority. Her contemplation was interrupted when she spotted Gabriel stepping out from the shadows. With a bright smile directed at her, he asked if she would like a tour. Gratefully accepting his offer, thus began Camille's adventure as the housekeeper of the chateau. What Camille discovered was that the employer lived in solitude, having done so for many years, largely due to his imposing demeanor, which instilled fear in those around him. Whispers of unkind tales circulated, and people treated him with rudeness whenever he ventured out into the world. Gabriel was the sole link between the Baron and the outside community. He had initially begun running errands for the Baron many years ago, but over time he had come to admire and cherish the man hidden behind that stern exterior. He reassured Camille that the Baron's growl was far worse than his actual nature. Each day, Gabriel devoted himself to tending to the Baron's needs at the grand house, returning each night to his modest family home on the outskirts of town. "Believe me, miss," he urged earnestly, "the Baron is truly fair and kind at heart." Gabriel led Camille through the expansive rooms and winding corridors of the chateau, which bore signs of neglect in many areas. Along the shadowy hallways lay unused bedrooms, shrouded beneath layers of dust. The fireplaces stood cold and silent, while some chambers had remained untouched for decades or even centuries. Furniture and belongings were piled high in those forgotten spaces, cloaked in cobwebs. The windows struggled to let in any light from outside, their glass coated with years of grime. As Camille began her journey, she quickly realized that only a handful of rooms were frequented on a daily basis, and her task was to clean and organize these spaces. Among them were the kitchen, the Baron's study, and the front entryway. Yet the most enchanting room of all was the library. Gabriel graciously permitted Camille to sneak a glimpse inside while the Baron was otherwise engaged, and what she beheld left her in awe. Before her lay an expansive room adorned with lofty ceilings and shimmering gold accents. Towering bookcases reached all the way up to the ceiling, lining every wall except where windows allowed light to pour in. Rolling ladders rested at either end of the room, ready to glide across the shelves and grant access to any book within reach. Countless volumes beckoned from their places, spines in vibrant hues of crimson, forest green, navy blue, and rich brown seemed to call out for someone to explore their pages. As an avid reader who had cherished the few books available during her father's financial struggles, Camille had never encountered such a magnificent collection before. Gabriel shared that the Baron often spent hours here, and it was easy to believe. Tables scattered throughout this luxurious haven were strewn with books, open to specific passages or grouped together thoughtfully, while well-worn leather armchairs suggested countless evenings spent immersed in their weighty texts. Gabriel solemnly mentioned that it was his duty to keep the fire crackling in the grate throughout the day. Camille imagined what it would feel like to select one of those many tomes and sink into a plush chair, inhaling the delightful aroma of aged paper infused with ink. It was truly magical. She understood that if she wanted to make any progress in this neglected home, she simply needed to choose a spot. and begin. On her first day there, she and Gabrielle dusted off the front hall and tidied up the kitchen. For quite some time, Gabrielle and the Baron had been preparing simple meals in that space, but much of it needed care and attention. While Camille wasn't exactly a culinary expert, she took pleasure in reviving the kitchen's former luster. She sent Gabrielle into town with a shopping list in hand. Then, in the grand yet silent kitchen, she set to work. Countertops long untouched were cleared of dust. Pots and pans received a good polishing. And slowly but surely, that cold and empty space began to hum with life once more. By the time she sat down for dinner with the Baron, she had prepared a modest meal of roasted chicken. It may not have been extravagant, but pride swelled within her as she presented it. With little time to prepare, Camille hurried back to her room. Gabriel had rekindled the fire, and she took a moment to freshen up at her washstand before slipping into her finest dress. As she approached the window to draw the curtains for the evening, she paused, captivated by the darkness outside. The courtyard was still, as if holding its breath in anticipation. Not a single creature stirred. Even the birds were silent. The ground seemed wrapped in a blanket of tranquility. With a gentle motion, she closed the velvet curtains and reluctantly turned away from the window. There was so much yet to explore in this enchanting place, she thought. Lighting a candle, she ventured down the softly lit hallway and descended the wide staircase. Upon reaching the tall dining room doors, she marveled at their grandeur. The room felt remarkably opulent for just 2 guests. It must have witnessed lavish parties and splendid formal dinners in days gone by. Looking up, she admired the dazzling crystal chandelier that hung above like a twinkling night sky. Gabriel had set 2 places at one end of the long table, and dinner awaited her arrival. She was the first to enter. Her wait was brief. Soon enough, the Baron's imposing figure appeared awkwardly in the doorway. He paused for a moment, offering a brief nod as a greeting. He then gestured towards the 2 place settings, inviting her to take a seat. Camille settled into one of the plush chairs with delight. "I see you and Gabriel have been quite busy today," remarked the Baron, raising his eyebrows at the hearty meal laid out before them. "He has shouldered much as my sole assistant these past years. I'm glad you will be here to help share some of his responsibilities." Camille nodded, momentarily unsure of how to respond. "You are my lord," she began hesitantly, but he shook his head gently and replied, "Please, just call me Antoine." He added with a hint of humor, "I am lord of nothing now, merely the lord of this chateau and its collection of dusty relics." Looking deeply into her eyes, he spoke softly, "I regret the circumstances that have led you here, but I hope you can find solace. I aim to be just, and it brings me joy to have your company." Camille nodded with a brief smile. "Would you like me to organize the library tomorrow?" she asked. "I wasn't certain if you wanted me to go in." After a moment's consideration, the Baron nodded in agreement, allowing her access. He then added, "Please feel free to borrow any book that catches your interest from the library." As Descartes wisely noted, reading great books is like conversing with the finest minds of history. You'll find my library is quite remarkable, filled with every title you can imagine. It has a certain magic about it. Surprised by his kindness and cultured nature, Camille watched her somewhat melancholic employer as he dined. Having spent only a day at the chateau, her view of her situation had already begun to transform. She now realized she was the lady of a magnificent estate, free to work as she wished, and she had just been granted access to an extensive library. Perhaps this unexpected turn of events wouldn't be as grim as she had anticipated. Lost in thought while gazing at her plate under the flickering firelight, all she could hear was the gentle clinking of silverware against china. Throughout dinner, the Baron and Camille shared few words, finishing their meal in tranquil silence. Later that night, nestled comfortably in the crisp white sheets of her grand canopy bed, Camille felt a sense of hopefulness. This secluded estate held many fascinating secrets, and she looked forward to discovering them in time. Rolling onto her side, she sleepily admired the tightly drawn drapes that shielded her from the darkness outside. Inside the chateau, a warm flame flickered gently, casting a comforting glow that enveloped her. The next day, after tidying up the kitchen, Camille cautiously made her way to the library. Knowing that the Baron was occupied in his study, provided her with an opportunity to explore the splendid collection of books under the pretense of cleaning. With a duster in hand, she carefully navigated around the shelves and tables, attending to surfaces that had long been neglected by dust. Just as she was about to rearrange a stack of books, Antoine appeared in the doorway. "Kindly avoid disturbing any stacks or opening any books," he gently requested. Camille, realizing her mistake, took a step back from the pile she had inadvertently touched. "There's no need to say sorry," he replied with a warm smile. "I completely understand that it might appear a bit messy. I'm in the midst of some research and wouldn't want to misplace my notes." He then asked if she had chosen a book for herself. She admitted that she hadn't and requested any recommendations he might offer. Camille shared her feelings of inadequacy when it came to understanding such profound literature, feeling that her background was less scholarly than his. Antoine smiled warmly, gestured expansively, and said, "Acknowledging one's ignorance is the first step toward wisdom." Noticing her confusion, he winked playfully and added that this piece of wisdom was attributed to Socrates. Moving across the room, he retrieved a small book from a lower shelf and handed it to her with care. "Perhaps you will find enjoyment in some of his other thoughts." He strongly believed in the importance of asking questions. Camille accepted the book with a grateful nod. Just as she was about to leave the room, she paused and revealed that she did have a question after all. "Is it possible for me to hire some villagers to tidy up the gardens before winter?" she asked. Antoine looked at her with a hint of sadness and shrugged. "If Gabriel can find anyone willing to come on to the estate, you're welcome to do so. Sadly, most are reluctant to enter the chateau grounds due to the outrageous stories that have circulated about me over the years, which has left me quite isolated. Camille frowned at this thought. How do you manage? Doesn't it frustrate you to be treated so unfairly? Le Baron gazed down thoughtfully before responding. I was once a more handsome, but vain and foolish man. It took a significant misfortune for me to recognize my mistakes and understand the disdain people hold for me. Perhaps it is merely retribution for my past errors. Camille fell silent, choosing not to ask any more questions that day, but feeling determined to learn more about how her employer had ended up in such a difficult position. For now, she looked forward to exploring Socrates' writings in her room after dinner. Camille quickly adapted to her new role as a housekeeper of the chateau, and even began to cherish it. With some persuasion, she managed to convince Gabrielle to hire a few local men, who arrived one day and cleared away years of neglect from the gardens. This was only after Camille had given them strict instructions not to harm the rosebush near the pergola, as it had been planted by Antoine's mother and held deep sentimental value for him. She felt a twinge of regret for inviting the village men into her home when she overheard their unkind words about Antoine. He's an absolute monster, one of them declared loudly to his companion. He lives like a beast in there, another chimed in, with no manners and unfit for human company. But I wouldn't mind taking his money, he finished crudely. Camille caught sight of Antoine by the window, absorbing their harsh remarks. She rushed to close it, desperate to protect him from their cruelty. Antoine waved her off, appearing unfazed. I've grown used to such talk, he said calmly. It has been many years since I could mingle with society. Camille was still troubled, asking, how can you endure such injustice? They don't even know you. How do you not despise them? He shrugged, his gaze drifting to a pile of books on a nearby table. A brilliant English playwright named William Shakespeare once penned, "There's no furnace so hot for your enemy that it doesn't scorch yourself by harboring goodwill toward these ignorant souls. I lighten my own burdens by forgiving them." With a gentle smile and a nod in Camille's direction, he suggested, "You might enjoy reading Shakespeare yourself. His plays are truly remarkable." Then he returned to his books, leaving Camille deep in thought about his words and the gloomy weather outside. Despite the heavy workload that awaited her each day, Camille found moments to explore the house. As autumn settled in with its crisp air, early sunsets, and cool evenings, she would stroll through the corridors holding a candle while using her hefty ring of keys to unlock the many closed doors lining the halls. Most rooms revealed themselves as bedrooms, hinting that this chateau had once welcomed numerous esteemed guests from the nobility. Each darkened room unveiled elegant four-poster beds, draped in dust sheets, fine furniture, and chairs covered in faded fabric. One day, she discovered what appeared to be a particularly special room. Unlike the others, it clearly belonged to a lady, and was still filled with her possessions. A delicate dressing table sparkled in the afternoon light, with jars of powder and shimmering perfume bottles neatly arranged upon it. Nearby stood elaborate wigs from days gone by on their own stands, as if patiently waiting for a grand ball to commence. As Camille opened the wardrobe, she was taken aback by a stunning array of silk dresses from the era before the Revolution. She delicately traced her fingers over the soft skirts, cautious that they might crumble under her touch. Imagining the graceful lady who once donned these garments, the room seemed to resonate with echoes of the past. When she ventured to the chest of drawers, a treasure trove of sparkling necklaces awaited her. Nestled within a small velvet box was a ring embellished with a shimmering sapphire. Camille carefully closed the container, making sure not to give off any impression of misappropriation. With a heavy heart, she left the room and secured it once more, feeling as though she had just stepped away from a portal to happier days. Truly, it was the most enchanting sight she had ever encountered in that house. Camille diligently penned letters to her father, which Gabrielle would take to town during his errands. In these notes, she reassured him of her well-being and expressed her enjoyment in her work. Over time, she even began sending him some money. After her first month had passed, the Baron informed her that he could no longer allow her to work without compensation, since she had more than compensated for the damage done to the rose bush. He expressed his wish for her to remain and offered her a weekly salary for her contributions, a proposal Camille gladly accepted. As Antoine's housekeeper, she felt she had discovered her true purpose. Her knack for organization flourished, and the delightful company, along with access to his extraordinary library, became her greatest sources of happiness. Though Antoine was regarded as unattractive, nothing about him had altered, except that Camille ensured his attire was well kept and presentable. Occasionally, while he passed by or during their conversations, she would catch a glimpse of an ordinary yet handsome man in the mirror. In those moments, he appeared less rugged, and his features seemed more balanced. However, after blinking and refocusing her gaze, she would see him return to his usual fearsome appearance. It felt as if the dark enchantment of the chateau was playing tricks on her perception. With a hint of irony, Camille observed that now and then a beggar would arrive at their doorstep, blissfully unaware of the estate's reputation in her village. Typically shunned by others, beggars rarely received aid. The townsfolk's attitudes suggested they believed those in poverty were deserving of their fate, and that diligent individuals did not find themselves in such unfortunate situations. Camille had expected Antoine to turn them away, but to her astonishment, he asked her to hand over the exquisite coins before they left. Intrigued, Camille couldn't help but ask about his unexpected generosity, especially since no one around him seemed to have offered him any kindness. Once again, he quoted a philosopher he admired, Aristotle, saying, "A truly noble person seeks no favors, but is always ready to extend kindness to others." With a hint of regret in his voice, he added, "I must strive to be more magnanimous, because it was my past choices that led me to ruin." Although Camille was eager to learn more about his story, she couldn't pry any further details from him at that moment. Still, she felt a strong desire to understand Antoine's past better. Later that evening, as they sat in the softly lit dining room, enjoying a hearty winter stew, Camille summoned her courage and broached the subject of Antoine's solitude at the chateau. After a brief pause filled with contemplation, Antoine sighed deeply, leaned back in his chair, took a sip of his drink, and began to share his tale. "Years ago," he said, "I lived here with my mother. After my father passed away, when I was young, I became the lord of this estate. My mother was a radiant soul who spread joy and kindness wherever she went. She was the one who cared for the rose bush that your father so carelessly stripped of its flowers." Antoine hesitated for a moment, clearly uncomfortable with the memories, before continuing. "When my mother fell ill and eventually passed away, I found myself alone and unprepared for what lay ahead. Unfortunately, I did not rise to the occasion. Young and reckless, I wasted our family's fortune on extravagant luxuries and lavish parties. I neglected the estate itself, left debts unpaid, and treated my staff poorly. Without my mother's wisdom guiding me, I descended into a life of excess that held no value for anyone, least of all for myself." He paused again before continuing his story. "One night, during one such extravagant gathering, my servant came to tell me about a woman at our door seeking food and charity. Caught up in my revelry, I heartlessly dismissed her request and told my servant to send her away and advise her to find work elsewhere. Just as he was about to do so, she pushed her way inside and foretold that my arrogance would lead to my downfall. She cursed me with a life of solitude and lovelessness until I learned compassion and embraced humanity as a path toward redemption." With a furrowed brow, Camille pondered Antoine's words. Humanity? What could she possibly mean by that? Antoine shrugged, a hint of frustration in his expression. "It's a mystery that has haunted me for years. Though I have access to an extensive library brimming with the insights of philosophers, mathematicians, and poets, I remain ensnared by my curse. My mind may expand, yet the collective wisdom of humanity has not revealed a way to my liberation." Camille watched him from across the table, her ears catching the gentle crackle of the fire that punctuated their silence. She envisioned him sitting alone before many fires over countless nights, with no one to share his thoughts. How many years had he spent confined in the solitary space, turning the pages of innumerable books in search of redemption? Antoine flashed a bright smile, attempting to dispel the awkwardness. "Well," he said cheerfully, as the brilliant Isaac Newton once remarked, "to arrive at the simplest truth requires years of contemplation. Perhaps one day I will uncover the answer hidden beneath her covers that very night." In that moment, Camille felt as if she were finally piecing together a puzzle. Over all these years, Antoine had devoted himself to study and reflection, embracing knowledge and remorse. He was no longer a man who would turn away kindness even from those deemed unworthy. Yet she couldn't help but wonder what else lay within him. Would he remain forever bound to this place, with only his books and dusty reminders of a regrettable past? She hoped not, for she had grown to admire him deeply. As she snuggled under her covers and gazed sleepily at the glowing embers in the hearth, the stillness of the house enveloped her like a warm blanket, lulling her into slumber once more. Throughout the biting chill of winter, Camille and Antoine found solace in each other's company at the chateau, with Gabrielle serving as their steadfast link to the outside world. Many rooms in their vast mansion remained locked and untouched. The areas they occupied were cozy and well kept, thanks to Camille's diligent care. Their meals were simple yet nourishing. Outside, piles of blinding white snow filled the courtyard, while cold winds whistled through deserted hallways. Yet within those walls, Camille and Antoine stayed close to their firesides, lost in their books and each other's company. At long last, the first whispers of spring graced the land. Camille received a letter from her father, sharing the joyful news that her eldest sister had found a suitor, and their wedding was set to take place in just a few weeks. He inquired whether the Baron might allow her to take some time off to celebrate the occasion at home. If permission were granted, Laurent would be more than happy to come and escort her from the estate. When Camille brought this request to Antoine, he set down his book, looked at her with a bittersweet smile, and replied, "Certainly, she must go, and she should take as much time as she needs." As Camille expressed her gratitude for his understanding, she once again failed to see a beast staring back at her. Instead, she saw only a man. She blinked several times to clear away the illusion. As she stepped out of the room, she hesitated for a moment, casting one last glance over her shoulder at him. Then she left him to his reading, trying to put that moment behind her. The journey to and from her sister's wedding passed without incident. Her family welcomed her with curiosity and perhaps a hint of newfound admiration. They marveled at the elegant new clothes she had purchased with her earnings. It was clear that the money she sent home had played a significant role in securing her sister's marriage. While it may have been a modest match, her family was no longer perceived as destitute by those in the village. Instead, they were seen as stable and respectable, thanks to Camille's steady income. Yet despite this shift in perception, Camille felt less connected to the family cottage than before. Although she had spent all this time within the walls of the chateau, it seemed as though her perspective had transformed, and her horizons had broadened immensely. Sitting around a fire with her siblings, who were preoccupied with their own trivial matters, made her feel confined. Though she regretted leaving her father once more, Camille felt a sense of relief when he said goodbye at the gates of Antoine's estate. She was ready to return to her role as mistress of the house. However, that joy quickly faded when she encountered the chaos awaiting her upon arrival. Gabriel opened the door with an eager grin, clearly thrilled by her return. He leaned in close and whispered that nothing had been quite right since she'd last laughed, and that the Baron had become disheveled and rarely left his library. After tidying up her belongings, Camille made her way to find Antoine. As she gently pushed open the door to the library, she was greeted by a scene of utter chaos. Books were strewn about haphazardly, some lying open in disarray, while empty glasses cluttered the tables. In the midst of this disorder, Antoine slouched in a chair, appearing as though he hadn't changed his shirt in days. At the sound of her entrance, he looked up with a sheepish expression that hinted at relief. In that moment, Camille struggled to reconcile her perception of him. Despite knowing he appeared unkempt and rather rugged, her eyes seemed to soften his image. It took her a moment to truly see him again. Yes, there he was, clearly in need of some uplifting spirit. In just a few days, Camille managed to restore order to the chaos around her. The dust and neglect accumulated over the past weeks were easily swept away, and with her return, Antoine's mood brightened almost instantly. Yet Gabriel confided in her that he wished she would leave once more. He explained that the Baron had fallen into a deep melancholy and had been utterly incapable of managing anything, even forgetting to take care of his meals. But with spring bursting forth all around the estate, it was hard to remain sad for long. Camille was filled with joy as she had successfully organized the clearing of the garden before winter's arrival. The courtyard now radiated beauty, showcasing the lovely plants that Antoine's mother had carefully arranged many years ago. A vibrant array of flowers blossomed delicately, enhancing the charm of their surroundings. Each day, the number of birds seemed to grow, their sweet melodies filling the mornings and inviting the residents of the chateau to bask in the garden's splendor. Camille and Antoine began to cherish their afternoons spent reading together beneath the pergola, often allowing Gabriel to finish his chores early so they could enjoy peaceful moments side by side. Camille also delighted in flinging open the windows of the once stuffy mansion, inviting in refreshing breezes. Life across the estate felt revitalized, as if a new chapter was unfolding. As summer drew near, Camille received a letter from her father announcing her sister's upcoming wedding. She found herself torn between a sense of duty to attend this family gathering and her desire to remain by Antoine's side. To navigate this predicament, she suggested an unconventional idea. He would join her at the wedding and stay at a nearby inn. Antoine was taken aback by her proposal, worried about how others might view him. Camille quickly reassured him that her village was far away and that the locals would not have any preconceived notions about him. In her heart, she no longer regarded him as a monster, but rather as the wise and gentle man she had come to love deeply. She trusted that her community would give him a fair chance. The thought of a nobleman attending a village wedding did not unsettle Camille. She had long since stopped seeing Antoine as a beast or merely a baron. Despite his initial hesitation, Antoine ultimately agreed to accompany Camille to ensure she wouldn't miss her sister's special day. However, he remained apprehensive throughout the preparations, casting a shadow over his mood. Undeterred by his somber demeanor, Camille took matters into her own hands and arranged for Gabriel to visit a local tailor for a new suit, tailored just for Antoine. She had noticed that he still wore clothes that were outdated by decades. The current fashion favored simple yet elegant styles, and she wanted him to don an outfit that would present him in a dignified manner, one that would make him appear more modern and less like an echo from the past. The rooms had been readied for her stay, and the carriage shone brightly after its thorough cleaning. At last, the day arrived when Gabriel bid farewell to the couple as they set off on their journey. It was a sight he had never witnessed before. The Baron leaving the estate, he reassured them that he would keep everything in order during their absence. The ride to Camille's village was swift, taking just one day, and it unfolded on a beautiful summer day. The season was alive with lush greenery as the horse trotted along the forest road. Sunlight filtered joyfully through the leafy canopy above, casting cheerful beams onto their path and whispering sweetly in the gentle breeze. At first, Antoine kept quiet, seemingly reluctant to share this public moment with Camille. Yet, after a few miles, he began discussing a book she had been reading. Their familiar playful banter soon returned, bringing a smile to Camille's face as she witnessed his best traits shining through. From her vantage point beside him, she felt as though she were seated next to a charming gentleman, and she decided not to break this delightful spell. Eventually, the pleasant journey came to an end as twilight descended, and crickets began their evening symphony in the fields. Antoine and Camille reached her family's cottage and brought the carriage to a stop before stepping down from their seats. There stood her entire family at the front door, her 4 unmarried siblings openly staring at them with curiosity. Laurent made an effort to regain his composure. He stepped forward and greeted Antoine with courtesy, expressing gratitude for accompanying Camille and honoring them with his presence. However, Camille felt heat rise in her cheeks when her brother leaned over to whisper something teasingly to her older sister, prompting a giggle from the girl. It was clear they were making light of the Baron's visit. Everyone breathed a sigh of relief when Antoine took his leave for his lodgings. Inside the cottage, Camille allowed herself to be guided into the warmth of home, where she spent the evening chatting with Laurent and her siblings about wedding preparations. Still, worry crept into her thoughts about how Antoine might be faring at the inn. She hoped he wasn't facing any unkindness there. As she nestled her head onto her pillow that night, thoughts of him lingered heavily in her mind. She felt a sense of relief wash over her as she anticipated the end of the wedding and their return to the chateau, which had come to feel like her true home. The atmosphere was somber when he arrived at the church the next day for the ceremony. It was clear that Camille's worries had come to fruition. They sat in quietude throughout the service, both acutely aware of the heavy gaze of the congregation upon them. The small church seemed even more confined, with everyone's eyes fixed on them. After the ceremony, the celebration unfolded on the village green. Though modest, it was filled with life. Punch flowed, cakes were shared, and wildflowers adorned the scene. In this cheerful setting, ladies formed little clusters, delicately enjoying their treats, while children danced across the lawn. delighting in an afternoon of carefree play. Yet Camille and Antoine felt a disconnection from the merriment around them. She stood stiffly beside him, acknowledging the villagers who had once shown her warmth and kindness. Those same friendly faces who had taught her about gardening and baking years ago now kept their distance, murmuring among themselves and exchanging knowing glances directed at her. Not a single neighbor offered a kind word to Antoine. He maintained a polite smile, but chose silence instead. Her own family provided no solace either, completely overlooking the couple as they navigated this challenging day. As Camille and Antoine stood there, fervently wishing for the gathering to come to an end, they caught snippets of a conversation between two men nearby. "You may have wealth," one remarked with a sly grin, "but he'll never convince anyone to marry him with a face like that." The other man chuckled in response. "It's quite pathetic when you have to woo your own maid." Those words were the final straw for Camille. Setting her punch aside, she marched to the center of the party and demanded everyone's attention with a firm declaration that she had something important to say. "I convinced the Baron to join me here because I believed you all were good people," she proclaimed. "I was sure that his noble spirit and kindness would show you that he is not the monster you all claim him to be. However, I must confess my error. None of you are worthy of his respect. We will no longer impose upon you. Let me be clear. Antoine is a far better man than any of you. I would choose him as my companion over each and every one of you, time and time again, and that is the truth." The room fell into stunned silence as everyone exchanged bewildered glances between Camille and Antoine. When she turned back to look at him, she was met with an astonishing sight. Where he once stood was now a handsome, dignified man, smiling gratefully at her. Despite her efforts to adjust her focus and clear her thoughts, his appearance remained unchanged. His strong features, well-groomed facial hair, and commanding presence had transformed before her eyes. He was as handsome as any man she had ever known, and that reality stayed constant. Whether it was a shift in her perception or perhaps a touch of magic at play, the other guests continued their merriment as if nothing had happened at all. They greeted Antoine warmly and smiled at Camille as if everything were perfectly ordinary. It felt as though the awkward incident had vanished into thin air. The villagers acted as if they had never encountered a beast among them before. It was both a mystery and a marvel. A veil had been lifted for good. This serene moment of victory signified Antoine's final liberation from the enchantment that had bound him. For many years, he had searched for answers within the pages of his library, exploring the depths of human knowledge. Yet, he had misjudged the woman who had cast a spell upon him. The lonely years spent nurturing kindness, generosity, and forgiveness had blossomed into the humanity that captured Camille's heart. This newfound essence was the key that shattered his curse. Soon after, Camille and Antoine found themselves together beneath the pergola in his garden, admiring his mother's rose bush, which was once again flourishing with vibrant blooms. As twilight settled over the chateau, crickets began their evening serenade, while the joyful couple reveled in the warm summer night. Camille gazed at Antoine, appreciating the handsome features that had long been hidden beneath a beastly exterior. As she watched him, he straightened himself and pulled from his pocket the ring she had admired in his mother's dresser. "You are the only one who truly took the time to understand me," he said earnestly. Then, with a twinkle in his eye, he quoted one of his many beloved books. As Copernicus said, "Everything revolves around the sun. You have become my son." With a playful wink, he added, "I believe you've shown yourself more than capable of managing this chateau." Camille chuckled and nodded enthusiastically as he slid the shimmering blue gem onto her finger. In awe, she recalled the first time she laid eyes on it in that enigmatic bedroom, filled with elegant dresses and sparkling jewels. It shimmered under the sunlight as if whispering a treasured secret to her. Now she felt herself becoming part of this estate's story. Before summer faded away, Antoine and Camille exchanged their vows in the courtyard of the chateau, surrounded by the delightful scent of blooming roses and the sweet melodies of birds singing high in the trees. Standing in the shadow of their home, Camille looked at Antoine with a heart brimming with gratitude, feeling a profound sense of belonging in a place that once felt strange to her. No longer was it the desolate abode she had encountered just a year prior. Through love, patience, and a quest for understanding, she and Antoine had unearthed true happiness together.